You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your bank app at 2 a.m., looking at your account balance, and you're thinking to yourself, where did all my money go?
You made decent money this month.
You weren't out here buying Lamborghinis or taking trips to Dubai.
You just lived.
A few dinners out, some stuff on Amazon, maybe a subscription or two.
And somehow you're still broke.
Here's the thing. You're not alone.
And more importantly, you're not crazy.
There's actually an entire economy operating right under your nose that's designed to make.
I'm talking about the subscription economy.
And this thing, it's bigger than the entire GDP of Switzerland.
My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about why smart people keep getting financially demolished by $9.99 charges.
If you're someone who feels like you make decent money but can never seem to get ahead, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Let me give you some numbers that'll make you uncomfortable.
The global subscription economy is worth over $650 billion annually. That's billion, with a B.
To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire economy of Sweden.
Bigger than Poland.
This classified economy, and I call it classified because most people have literally no idea how much they're actually spending on it, is quietly extracting wealth from your bank account every single month while you sleep.
Now, you might be thinking, come on, Nick, subscriptions, really? We're talking about Netflix and Spotify. That's like $20 a month.
And look, I get it.
That's exactly what they want you to think. But here's what most people don't realize. The average American is now spending $273 per month on subscriptions. That's $3,276 per year.
And here's the kicker. When researchers ask people to estimate how much they spend on subscriptions, the average guess is around $86 per month.
You're spending 3 times more than you think you are. Let that sink in for a second. You are hemorrhaging over $180 per month that you don't even know is leaving your account.
This is where it gets really interesting, because subscription companies aren't just selling you a service.
They're exploiting specific psychological vulnerabilities in your brain that make it almost impossible for you to accurately track or control this spending.
First, there's what behavioral economists call the pain of paying.
When you hand over a $20 bill for something, your brain registers that as a loss.
You feel it. There's a little psychological sting.
But when $9.99 gets automatically deducted from your checking account, your brain barely notices. It's abstract. It's digital. It's painless.
Companies know this. That's why everything is becoming a subscription.
Adobe used to sell Photoshop for $699 as a one-time purchase.
Now, it's $54.99 per month. Over 2 years, that's $1,319.76.
You're paying almost double, but it feels cheaper because you never have to make that big, painful decision to spend $699 all at once.
Second, there's the anchoring effect.
When you see just $9.99 per month, your brain anchors to that small number. $9. That's lunch. That's a coffee and a muffin. Your brain does not automatically multiply that by 12 and think, oh, that's $120 per year.
And it definitely doesn't think about the fact that if you keep this subscription for 5 years, you've spent $600. So what happened in the 2000s is that banks and hedge funds started buying credit default swaps not as insurance, but as bets.
They'd bet that certain companies or mortgages would fail, and if they were right, they'd make a fortune.
And because there was no limit to how many swaps you could buy on the same debt, the market exploded. By 2007, the credit default swap market was worth about $60 trillion.
For context, that's more than the GDP of the entire world at the time.
People were making bets on bets on bets, and nobody really knew who owed what to whom.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, Nick, but didn't we learn our lesson in 2008?
Didn't the government step in and fix this?
Look, here's what actually happened.
The crisis started with subprime mortgages. Basically, banks were giving home loans to people who couldn't afford them.
Then bundling those loans into securities and selling them to investors. Wall Street loved these things because they were rated AAA, which supposedly meant they were super safe.
But here's the kicker. Insurance companies like AIG were selling credit default swaps on these mortgage securities.
So investors would buy the sketchy mortgages, then buy insurance from AIG in case they went bad. AIG was raking in premiums, and as long as housing prices kept going up, everything was fine.
Then housing prices stopped going up.
When the mortgages started defaulting, AIG suddenly owed billions of dollars in payouts. And here's the thing, AIG didn't have the money.
They'd sold way more insurance than they could ever cover, assuming they'd never actually have to pay out.
And because the credit default swap market was so interconnected, AIG's collapse threatened to take down every major bank on the planet.
If AIG went under, the banks that bought swaps from them would lose billions, which would cause them to collapse, which would trigger more defaults, which would cause more payouts, and the whole system would spiral into oblivion.
So the US government stepped in with a $182 billion bailout. Not to save AIG, really. To save the banks that would have lost everything if AIG failed.
This is where it gets really interesting. The crisis wasn't caused by mortgages.
The mortgages were just the trigger.
The real problem was that the entire financial system had become one giant, interconnected casino where everybody was betting on everybody else's bets.
And when one domino fell, it threatened to take down the whole stack.
Okay, so after 2008, you'd think we'd ban credit default swaps, right?
Or at least heavily regulate them. Nope.
The Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 added some transparency requirements and forced some swaps to go through clearinghouses, but the market itself kept growing.
As of 2024, the notional value of the derivatives market, which includes credit default swaps, is estimated at over $600 trillion.
That's not a typo. $600 trillion. For context, global GDP is around $100 trillion. So the derivatives market is 6 times larger than the entire world economy.
Now, to be fair, notional value doesn't mean that $600 trillion is actually at risk.
Notional value is the total amount of underlying assets being referenced, not the amount that would actually be paid out. But even if the actual exposure is a fraction of that, say 5%, that's still $30 trillion.
Which is roughly the size of the entire US economy.
And here's the scary part. According to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, just 3 banks, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup, hold about 80% of all derivatives in the US banking system.
So, if one of these banks miscalculates, or if there's another systemic shock like 2008, we're not talking about one company failing.
We're talking about a collapse that could freeze global credit markets, trigger bank runs, and potentially send the world into a depression.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, Nick, but didn't we fix the problems from 2008?
Aren't banks required to hold more capital now? Isn't there more oversight?
Yes and no.
Banks do have to hold more capital under Basel III regulations, and there is more transparency in the derivatives market.
But here's what most people don't realize. The system is way more fragile than it was before.
First, interest rates. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were basically zero.
That meant borrowing was cheap and defaults were rare.
But since 2022, the Fed has jacked up rates to fight inflation, and suddenly, a lot of companies that could barely afford their debt at 2% interest are drowning at 7%.
According to Moody's, corporate defaults in 2023 hit the highest level since 2009.
And every time a company defaults, someone holding a credit default swap gets a payout.
If enough companies default at once, the banks that sold those swaps could be on the hook for billions.
Second, the too big to fail problem has gotten worse, not better.
Those three banks I mentioned, JP Morgan, Goldman, and Citi, are now bigger than they were in 2008. If one of them goes down, the government would have no choice but to bail them out again, because the alternative is global economic collapse.
And third, and this is the part that keeps me up at night, we have no idea how interconnected this stuff is. The credit default swap market is opaque.
Even with the transparency requirements from Dodd-Frank, a huge chunk of the market is still traded over the counter, meaning it's private contracts between two parties.
Regulators can't see the full picture. So we're in a situation where the market is bigger, interest rates are higher, corporate debt is shakier, and the banks are more concentrated than ever.
It's like we took the 2008 time bomb, made it 4 times larger, and then just hoped it wouldn't go off.
All right, so that's the bad news. The good news is that you're not powerless here. You can't stop the derivatives market from imploding. That's above our pay grade. But you can position yourself to survive it if it happens.
Here's what I'd recommend. 1. Diversify your bank accounts.
If you have more than $250,000 in one bank, you're not fully covered by FDIC insurance. Spread your money across multiple banks so that even if one fails, you're protected. 2. Hold some assets outside the banking system.
This is controversial, but hear me out.
In a systemic banking crisis, you want to own things that don't depend on the financial system functioning. That could be physical gold, Bitcoin, real estate, or even just supplies and tools.
I'm not saying go full prepper, but having some of your wealth in tangible assets is smart. Thanks for watching. Stay smart, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.